Join me, Mark Windows, with Tony Hurst for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT at autonomousmedia.net.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Windows on the World live. It's Sunday night, 9 o'clock, autonomousmedia.net, windowsontheworld.net, freemanjack.net, TuneIn Radio, and a couple of other places we're broadcasting from right now. Sorry about last week. Some family dramas and issues cropped up, and that didn't allow me to be getting here to do the show, so I let everyone down. Sorry about that, but we're here tonight, and we're keen to go. We've got a guest, and Mark will introduce him in a bit. How's your week been, Mark?
It's been all right, Tony. I've been finding out a lot of different things, and there's a court case that I'm looking into, and it gets deeper and deeper, and it's very much indicative of what's going on everywhere. We're just being lied to at every level, and we've covered this in great depth. But what's interesting, if it is interesting, which it should be to most people, and we're going to get to that later because a lot of people just aren't getting this at all, is that there's certain techniques used. It doesn't matter who's using them, whether it's your local council, the police. We've talked about all this stuff. We've talked about Delphi technique, things like that. Now, Delphi technique, being invented by the Rand Corporation in the 1950s, was a way of gaining group consensus. Now, I'm sure everybody out there is familiar with these terms, group consensus. There's a consensus on it. Well, that used to mean that everybody agreed on something, and it was the consensus. What it means now is that people are being coerced into agreeing, or they're not agreeing, and we're being told there's a consensus. And that's really what Delphi technique is all about. And if you haven't heard of it, look it up, because all of your local council meetings are controlled by Delphi technique. We've covered this. We've done so many shows on regeneration, Tony. I was looking back at some of them today. And what's astonishing is that the same tactics are used over and over and over again. It's a template that's going on all over the country and indeed all over the world through the Agenda 21, which is now Agenda 2030. And these principles are what we call sustainable development. But it ties into such a big picture. And I think this is the problem that people have with it, that they can't conceive something as big and well organised as this is actually going on because they haven't been told. But once you get your head around it, it starts to make sense. We've done countless shows on this, but we have to keep repeating ourselves. And if we keep repeating ourselves, then people will probably eventually start getting it, and they are. We talked to Sandy, well, it's a couple of weeks ago now, about Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, how that was being rolled out in rural communities. We're all going to go into that tonight, actually, because we're going to talk about this sort of satellite developments that are being built up around London. We've talked about what's happening in London with the regeneration, which is very frightening and goes into this big social cleansing agenda. What we're seeing on the outskirts of London, however, is house building. But what they're doing is they're building these new estates with very little apparent consultation, but everyone seems to be agreeing. And then we're finding out that the infrastructure of these places just won't cope. Now, one of the big ideas of Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, is to get cars off the road. And they can't do that by saying, we're going to ban cars. So they do it stealthily by taxation, by making it impossible to drive. Not just through taxation, of course, through the low emission zone, the ultra low emission zone, which the useful idiot stroke puppet communist subversive or Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is bringing in. And they're using him because he's a compromised puppet and he won't question anything. But the thing is, we're seeing this in every borough now. And what happens after all this is we start seeing 20-mile-per-hour zones, the road humps. We've seen these for many, many years, but this was all the beginning of it. It's all about making life more difficult. Now, let's talk about, for instance, road humps. We did a show a few years ago with a chap called Peter Colley. And he lives down in Hounslow, and he's quite an intrepid kind of person. In fact, he could be classed as a bit of a loony by most people who live in what we call civilized society, which, of course, we dip in and out of when we need to. But he went around measuring the road humps in Hounslow and found out that they were massively illegal, and they were damaging people's cars. But he found out there's nothing that could be done about it, and all these councillors were saying yes to the road humps. Now, road humps are extremely dangerous for ambulances. I had a really badly broken arm, and the agony of going over road humps with broken bones is indescribable.
Yep.
Even if you've had medication. I smashed my arm in several places, and going over these things, it's just a nightmare. I was on laughing gas and morphine, and it was still really hurting. So the whole idea of these road humps, they call it traffic calming, but it's actually traffic trauma, because when you go over them, you have to accelerate again, creating more fumes. So it's not an environmental issue. It's to make you feel uncomfortable. And they say, oh, it's a road safety issue. No, it's not, because they're in areas where there's not any problem with that. But they invent a problem. For instance, in Waltham Forest, we saw the council actually creating traffic jams and diverting cars down roads which had counters on them to make it look as though these so-called rat runs, remember, these aren't rat runs, these are where people live, making it look like these places were getting too much traffic, too much pollution, so they're pushing it all out onto the major roads, which then become gridlocked. And then you stay inside your little village, your little smart environment, smart cities, walkable villages, sustainable cities, smart cities, all this stuff that we've talked about. It's all about hived housing with people with no cars. That's why they promote cycling. Well, they don't promote cycling. What they do is they discriminate against motorists. So this is what we call equality. We've talked about this so-called equality. There is no equality because there's no marker for equality. So what they're doing is they're empowering groups like cyclists. No, they're not. They're making them militant. That's not empowerment. We've already got empowerment if we believe in what we're doing and saying. So what they're doing is they're making groups turn against each other. And this is what they're doing very successfully all over the country. Now, we talked about the outskirts of London, and this goes into these new housing developments that are happening. And we've talked to several people about them. We've talked about Buntingford in Hertfordshire. Buntingford in Hertfordshire is a place that has many new houses being built, far more than it should have been given or was agreed. And we talked to somebody about that, and then we had Martin on. I think Martin's listening tonight, Martin Houston. We made a show called Britain's Villages Destroyed, and I'd like to just play a little bit of that as an opener, because it's what we're going to be talking about broadly tonight. But first, before I go into that, a little bit more background. We've talked about, you know, how they're getting people out of the countryside, but they also need these satellite towns. And these satellite towns, which are really villages, which were villages on the outskirts of London or outside any city, are being used as corridors into cities. And of course, a lot of them have good rail links, so they want everyone on the train. They haven't thought the infrastructure through, though. The infrastructure really hasn't been thought about because, as we said, doctors' surgeries can't cope. Roads are gridlocked. And, of course, the key to this is to say that you can't take your children to school anymore. Doesn't matter if you live 6 miles away. They're going to have to walk or cycle. This is totally impractical. And they are now fining people who are dropping their kids off at school. And this is getting more and more draconian all the time. You will see it in your local area. You will see this sort of stuff happening, and the closing off of roads, etc. But what we're going to talk about is outside London tonight. We've gone through how all of this is done through legislation, and we're going to talk to a chap called Chris who's experienced this firsthand, and he's actually given a rather comedic response to it all, which is brilliant, because this is something you don't see very often, this kind of satire. And this satire was very clever but very serious, because he started to make really good points. And the thing is, it got from the local paper into the Daily Mirror. And I'm just going to read a bit about what Chris said to me about what was happening around his local area in Hertfordshire. So he said to me, I've recently noticed some very strange behaviour in my neighbourhood. In 2013, there were plans to build 63 houses on a field adjacent to where I live. The council planning department were bombarded with objections. There was a petition, and the police had to be called when residents protested outside the council offices. Now, I'll just interrupt that for a minute, because this is exactly what happened in Waltham Forest. 2,000 people turned up after Mini Holland was imposed on the local residents. And of course, there was a consensus that they all agreed, 65%, which was a lie, because the consensus happened before the public consultation. And you'll find this happening quite a lot. However, Chris carries on. As usual, the newspaper got it wrong. At that time, there were no plans for 750 houses, only 63. Now, this year in 2017, there are plans to build 380 houses, and only 4 people, including me, in my vicinity have objected. Everyone else seems lethargic, with the opposite attitude to what they had in 2013. I wrote a 25-page report, but with a difference. Over the decades, I've sat through numerous planning meetings and heard the same waffle over and over again. All planning meetings, documents and objections are boring, so I decided to liven things up a bit and used humour to get my point over. It took 6 months of research and a month of putting it together. Within a day of submitting the report, the local newspaper contacted me, and then it reached the national press. I have no time for the mainstream media, and it was politely offhanded, and I made it clear I wasn't interested in giving them an interview and not keen on them publishing anything, but they went ahead anyway. The difference between 2013 and now is the developer is now using a PR company. And we're finding this all over the place. And what they do, they bring in these PR companies, and they're the equivalent of what we call change agents. We've got to remember, this is all corporate now. Everything's corporate. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about change agents in non-government organisations or commercial organisations that use change agents. They're all doing it. There's a blurring of the line. Remember, public-private partnerships. This is what it's all about. It's all about bringing in corporates. So what he said, he says, I'm currently endeavouring to find out if similar things have happened elsewhere in the country, whereby people have suddenly become lethargic about objecting to building developments. This is where I would like to ask a favour. If anyone contacts Windows on the World with a similar story to mine, I have no objections if you pass my details on to them. Okay, so Chris has offered to kind of liaise with people up and down the country. Now, this is very, very interesting because I've looked at one of these companies, these PR companies that get involved with planning locally. Now, remember that these are in partnerships with the developers. They're working for developers, and often we're going to find links between these companies and the developer in that they are probably the same company. With this company, I'm not sure, but I'm going to give you an example of what they're saying. And let's think about community organisers, all these people we've been talking about, and how they operate through Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. And what we're getting here is a form of communism in the respect that if we go back to things like the Frankfurt School, which was something that came out of Frankfurt in Germany, and it was basically a load of communists who had an idea to change things through a thing called the Frankfurt School. And what they did was they kind of moved the goalposts of reality. In other words, they were saying that facts don't have to be facts. Facts can be belief. So if you believe in something, it's a fact. And this is the sort of thing that's happening right across the public sector and, of course, the private sector as well. So let's have a look what one of these companies, one of these community engagement companies says, these PR companies. Number one, understand the community and identify the key players. Now, this is interesting, isn't it? Identify the key players. So, in other words, this is not public relations. This is controlling of the narrative. Targeting, exactly. Not just from the internet, but in-depth research. So what they do is they go in and they find out who the people are they have to influence, and then they go in and influence them. Makes sense, doesn't it? So let's see what it says, carrying on. Get to know them. Not just know of them. Meet them and listen to them. Identify supporters among the decision makers. There you go. Identify supporters among the decision makers. Now that's very, very important, because every single tenants group that I've come across has been infiltrated. And we talked about this with the Grenfell Tower disaster. I said at the time that the people who were genuine there would be overshadowed because new people would be brought in to control the narrative. Who did we see on television? And who went into those meetings? We got people who were not credible, making very stupid statements. And this is what happens. They bring in people either to make the existing group look stupid or to take it over. You still there, Tony?
Yep, I'm here.
That's all right. I thought maybe I had a problem with the connection. Anyway, carries on. Find out what they want and make it their project as well as yours. Delphi technique in one. So in other words, they tell you what you're going to get and you get what you're given. So they say, we want to engage with you. We want to find out what you want. And then, all of a sudden, you've agreed to what they wanted. But it's what you wanted as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
This is what we agreed on.
Yeah, it's more like making them want what you want them to want or what they want them to want. So, what
you do is you give limited choices and you steer them into what you want. It's a bit like sales, actually. There's not that much difference between selling windows and the Delphi technique. And the things that get up my back about window salesmen really get up my back with Delphi technique, because at least with a salesman, you know he's trained to try and bully you into buying the product, yeah? You know that's what he's there for, so you can't really blame him.
Yep.
You know, and he's working on commission. You don't be too rude to those people. You know that they're trained. You know that they're going, well, we haven't got that one this week, so we have got this one, and it's 30% off this one. We could fit it tomorrow. And this is what they do. We know that's sales. And you can't really blame them. But when you get the Delphi technique, it's much more subversive. And what these people are doing is using techniques which are psychological warfare. And we did a little show actually last week, Tony. It was all about the 7-7 Brigade, which is the MOD trolling people on Facebook, but telling them they're going to do it. That's just typical of the MOD. It's kind of more Dad's Army than Mossad. I think I made that comment because people were saying this is all rather sinister, but there's a side issue. But it's a very similar kind of thing. We're talking about psychological manipulation here. However, it carries on. Broaden the consultation to engage the wider community in the process. Be innovative. Not just a few exhibitions. Not just a few exhibition boards in a drafty hall. Be innovative, yeah? Broaden the consultation to engage the wider community in the process. Proactively engage with media. Consistently monitor and engage with new and traditional media. So that means basically they send people into the community to spy. And this is very similar to what I was hearing years ago when we were talking about these groups who are mentored in, the change agents, the social entrepreneurs, the community interest companies. You know those, don't you? They're the ones that get all the funding. Where did they get the funding? How did they get the funding? My little business didn't get the funding, but theirs did. I don't understand it. Oh, they're a community interest company, but who are they interested in? Because they've just moved into the community. They're not part of the community. You'll find this. They talk about community. Whenever they talk about community, look at the opposite. They're people who've never been there, know nothing about it, and they're not interested in it. That's what community means under these new kind of descriptions, they're coming up with. Maintain momentum. Stay in touch and continue to listen and truly involve the community and its representatives. Now, this is very Saul Alinsky, maintain momentum. In other words, when you have something you want to target, you don't let up on it. Now, this can work for good or bad. It's like, okay, no, we know you really want this. We know you want this and you're going to have it. Or it can be that, oh, you're a problem, aren't you? You're a problem. We're going to do something about it. We're not going to leave you alone until you back off. We're not going to let you have a minute's rest. We're all going to bombard you. And this is the more sinister side of the Saul Alinsky rules for radicals. Nothing's off the charts with it. It can be interpreted in any way you want it to. So, yes, that's very, very interesting. And we've seen how this social cleansing is going on everywhere. And we've had Savills write policy for local councils. Council meetings are full of actors performing sound bites. We have a thing called managed decline. You'll find even out of London that the council housing is being stripped and declined, and they're getting new developments which are 4 or 5 times the price, and then it's called affordable housing. So it's all been covered in our shows, and we've seen how even in a London boroughs, have gone against judicial review. So this tells people that we're not talking about a local issue. We're talking about something much bigger than that. So this is affecting every part of the country. So what people have to do is oppose any kind of demolition. This may sound really odd, but this is where you'll start to find that they're exposing themselves and their techniques, because once you start opposing them, you'll begin to see the psychological manoeuvres that are happening. And of course, we've talked about tenancies being destroyed. You get a community hub, the real community centres disappear. We talked about this with Sandy. She's got a local pub, and that's being targeted. She's getting a lot of trouble from local authorities, whereas the new community hubs don't get that at all. And they have things in there that are very expensive, but not necessarily for local people. And we've talked about this in venues in London, smaller real community venues getting shut down by change agents. Saul Alinsky rules for radicals people. This is an epidemic. In fact, the point that Chris has made was this, which is very, very important, is that people have become asleep to it. And they're acting like zombies in a lot of these places. They're not able to even see what's going on. But once you look at the template for this, you can see it everywhere. And people are going to say, sounds like a conspiracy. Well, it is a conspiracy, because a conspiracy only takes two people performing an action which may be illegal, and often is. And a lot of what's being done here is actually illegal, because there's no real consultation being had, but they're pretending that it's going on.
Yeah, I see. It's all linked up, and like you say, we talked about it a lot. We've got an interesting comment in the chat there from a friend of ours, and I know him to be an ex-surveillance police officer, and his comment is, I was once asked by a law firm on behalf of a property developer to deploy covert cameras on a town's common in order to gather evidence that it was only being used by dog walkers, a tiptoe tactic towards a housing development. So I'm kind of backing up what you're saying there.
Well, exactly. I don't think people realise that this is a technocracy. It really is, because we're talking about smart cities here, smart motorways, everything monitored, everything going back in real time, information being basically data mined by corporations on everything. And your data's not safe with anybody. There isn't any data protection. There's none. There is no data protection for the public. This is a fact. They cite the Data Protection Act when you want to get some information to block you. They don't use it. It's not for you. It's for people who want to block information. That's what the Data Protection Act's for.
Yep.
Because everything, even your local authority is sharing everything with third parties. How many times have you signed up for something with a local council or any organisation, and you're getting loads of third parties phoning you? They're selling the data on. They're doing it all the time, and they're providing it to any government agency that wants it. It's all universal. You see, it's universal credit. It's everything. It's all rolled into one. And we've got Bechtel and Lendlease. These are global corporations who are in partnership with your local council. They won't be far away. The removal of all the social meeting places, and this is what's happening outside London as well, as we're going to find out. But I'd like to get into this article, actually. We're going to bring Chris on soon, and it's from the Daily Mirror. It was originally in his local paper, the Mercury, but it says, neighbour writes hilarious 25-page objection to huge development near his home, describing the plans as bovine excrement. Okay, a witty resident has written a 25-page satirical objection to a huge housing development near his home, referring to the plans as bovine excrement. Developer has submitted plans for 380 homes, a 64-bed care home, community area and primary school on land in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire. Now, this is what they're doing. They're creating what they're calling a local community. But what they're doing is destroying the infrastructure, because all these people are going to block the roads up. The schools are going to be overcrowded. And what they're trying to do is make you stay in one place. But this is one thing I want to talk to Chris about, because these are in commuter belt areas. And that's where it's interesting, because a lot of these people, they want on trains in and out of London. And that's why they're basically overdeveloping little villages like Buntingford in Hertfordshire. We had a guy come down about 18 months ago, and I've heard several people talking about this, because I know that little village, and it is a very small village, and it's being made into this kind of big hub because it's got transport there into London. So let's carry on with this. Chris is very much against the proposed development and went to extreme lengths to make his feelings known. In fact, he used the same structure as a typical planning statement, complete with contents page, to sarcastically raise his objections in a 25-page document, reports the Hertfordshire Mercury. So what could possibly stop the proposal going ahead? This is his first question. Perhaps a bulldozer may accidentally hit the tomb of Eric the Flatulent, a little-known king who introduced a vegetarian and whole-grain diet into Britain. If that happens, the area will become a World Heritage Site. I don't think so. 2. Maybe ornithologists may find the rare Umibum bird. It has short legs and has difficulty landing, nesting exclusively in Rags Valley before migrating to East Grinstead. The area would then become a protected nature reserve. Now, that's actually not as satirical as Chris thinks, because this is what they're doing. They're creating these wetland projects. Yep. And we talked about that last week. In other words, they're going to bring in areas where there's wildlife, and they're going to say, oh, yeah, the rare lesser spotted grebe is breeding in this area. Oh, that's great, isn't it? It's a conservation area all of a sudden. That means that we can't build on that. It also means that ultimately you're not going to be allowed on it, because it's got to be carbon neutral too, and it's a community. The grebe is a community, so we can't infringe on their community. And this is what Agenda 21 is all about. It's about fake empowerment. So basically, if they want to get you off the land, they empower some species that they say is on there and is under threat. It's a total lie. It's like they want Hackney Marshes to become carbon neutral. Well, carbon neutral means we're not allowed on. And this is all in their plans. So, yeah, that's not actually as wacky as Chris thinks. But then again, Chris knows all about planning, so it's probably quite prescient what he says there. Possibly there will be a mass awakening to the stark reality of what is really going on. If that happens, the environmental destruction of Rags Valley could be stopped. Sadly, around 80 years of social engineering has created mass cognitive dissonance. Now, isn't it great to see that in the Daily Mirror?
Yeah, those words.
Around 80 years of social engineering has created mass cognitive dissonance. I wonder if anyone who reads the Mirror understands that, understands the bigger picture of what he's saying there. Therefore, there's probably much more chance of governments telling the truth about taxation than a mass wake-up happening. Not much hope there, then. The 60-year-old opens the objection by describing notifications of the plans which were delivered in a brown envelope as something brown and nasty on my doormat, but had nothing to do with my neighbour's dog. He lists tongue-in-cheek positives to the plans, which includes saying that they will bring more food for roadkill enthusiasts and that Rags Valley would be destroyed. He writes, instead of eating the usual barbecued bunny, the odd tabby cat scraped off the road and squirrel burgers, the new housing development promises a gourmet delight. As animals flee in terror from bulldozers, they will inevitably run into the road where they will be knocked down by oncoming traffic. In section 3, titled Ministry of Silly Planning, he asks, will the borough of Broxbourne get the Stalin Memorial Award for dictatorship excellence? Chris, who is writing a book on the psychology of people and has written similar lengthy objections to other planning applications in the past. So it goes on, there's the, let's put a spin on it, where are the eco-fascists when you need them, the Ministry of Silly Planning, the democratic illusion, communism on steroids, it's bovine excrement, Jim, but not as we know it, carries on. And it's very, very interesting because it brought this into the public arena, whereas it wouldn't have been mentioned without this satirical kind of way he's put it together. He says, the way I look at it is I write so many, but I only need one or two of them to be picked up and have an effect, so it does not demotivate me, he said. This is talking about what he's written here. He says, I hope it gives people a laugh, but there is a serious point to it too. So I'd like to bring on Chris just after we play the opening, Britain's Villages Destroyed. Could you just play that one, Tony?
Yeah, sure. We'll be back in 2.5 minutes with Chris.
Welcome to Windows on the World. We've talked about regeneration, the re-engineering of London, but how is this affecting the rest of the country? There's been massive building programs going on for several years, and we're going to talk about that today, how it's affecting infrastructure and what this means to people all over the UK. Now, this is from 2014. I've been looking at a few newspaper articles just before a lot of this regeneration and out-of-town building started. This is from a newspaper article from 2014. Britain's villages are under attack from predatory developers exploiting relaxed planning laws, the Countryside Bible is warning. Country Life magazine says rural communities are being ruined by house builders. Let off the leash by David Cameron. It is now escalating everywhere. As a result, large estates are being built on the outskirts of villages, leaving residents with overcrowded schools and oversubscribed GPs. Now, those who try to defend themselves from this rather ugly and ill-conceived housing, which doesn't really fit into local areas, are being described as NIMBYs. So there's a lot of political correctness involved in the rhetoric here as well. Now, locals claim that the Hertfordshire village of Buntingford has become a dumping ground for Londoners who've been priced out of the capital, and planning permission for 1,000 houses has already been granted. Residents say there's already insufficient infrastructure to support such rapid expansion, and schools and doctors' surgeries are overflowing. And Toby Archer, chairman of Buntingford Chamber of Commerce, said, "We're just being shafted by the local council. A district plan should have been in place. This is just carte blanche for developers. We were told to expect 500 houses. Now we're getting 1,500. And this is the story that seems to be happening all over the country now. Remember, this is going back to 2014. Now, this also goes into the National Planning Policy Framework, which the government introduced 2 years ago to boost development by cutting red tape. The guideline says councils must adopt a presumption in favour of planning permission. Now, Buntingford in Hertfordshire and Letwardine in Herefordshire and Castlecary in Somerset are among many communities whose character is most at risk from developers. Thinking about this now, there'll be several more, and probably you will be able to identify some of these places around your local area if you live just outside a large town or indeed in the countryside. Now, this is just a snapshot of what's going on all over the place. So it's not just happening in and outside large cities, it's badly affecting rural areas.
Join me, Mark Windows, with Tony Hurst for Windows on the World Live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT at autonomousmedia.net.
Yep, and here we are. Take it away, Mark.
Well, that was great, because that was a show we did a while ago with Martin Houston, I think, who's listening tonight, now in the Isle of Man. And he was living in a little village called Alsey at the time. I think he's just mentioned that in chat. And this massive development was being built then. And most people I've come across are saying this. The people who are living outside London, and these places, they're being seen as satellites of commuter transport and hubs for people to live. So what they're doing is they're creating these places, and they haven't thought it through, like we've been saying, really, in the infrastructure. The infrastructure gets crowded, there's too many cars, people can't get to the doctors, the doctors get oversubscribed. The infrastructure and the schools are basically so heavily leaned on that these places are going to become really difficult to live in. And that, I think, is part of the Global Action Plan, because they are impoverishing everybody's rights, basically. They're taking away the things that really you should be able to take for granted and turning them into not rights, but actual, basically making them into luxuries. You know, it's like it's having a roof over your head under this new sort of world communist system is something that you have to really, really aspire to now. And we're seeing this with the amount of homeless people. The amount of homeless is an epidemic, and it's being completely hidden. They are busing people out of London and dumping them in seaside places. And if you go to places on the East Coast, you will see this, indeed all over Britain. And they're destroying the seaside towns by putting in people who have been bussed out of London and people disappearing out of London quite rapidly. And some of them will be going into these new developments. But this is going to be very interesting because all over the country, people are going to start seeing it, and they have been seeing it for quite some time. And at this point, I'd like to bring in Chris. Are you there, Chris?
Mark? Yes, I'm here, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear.
That's good. And hello,
I really like what you did. Oh, yes, sorry. I really like what you did with the article because it was quite silly and very easy to get, but you put in some really powerful stuff in there about social cleansing and all the rest of it, and basically what this is, which is a global communist agenda, but it's done with this front. So when you actually mention that this is communism to people, they'll laugh at you. It's like they did in that meeting with that American fella, Grindle 61, in California. He said this is communism, and they all laugh and sniff, much more educated than him. But it's actually what it is. We're talking about something here where people have no input whatsoever, and you've just been on the receiving end of this, haven't you, Chris?
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yes. I mean, what you find is that, first of all, with this 25-page report that I did, I deliberately started it humorous, and it gradually gets serious. But what I've found is that I've looked on the local council, the letters, where the people send in their objections and that, and on there's communication. The local council have actually communicated with, was it Sport England?
Yes.
Now, a couple of days ago, I received a letter from, guess who? Sport England. And at the top of the letter heading, it says Sport England, Arts Council England, and Public Health England. And they want me to complete an online survey, and they'll give me a £5 gift voucher. Isn't that nice? Now,
oh yeah,
isn't that a strange coincidence that they want me to do an online survey, and the local council have actually contacted the same people? Maybe a coincidence, I don't know. But what's happening with this development is there's going to be a green patch in the middle, so they say, for sport and recreation. Now, you know as well as I, that ain't going to remain a green patch for very long, because that's the foot in the door. And what's happening is that I believe that is being pushed similar to, what happened on a project I was working on many years ago in the northeast of England. And what happened was there was a housing development. Some developers wanted to put a housing development in an area which was quite a picturesque sort of place, but they knew they weren't going to get away with it. They thought, well, how the hell, are we going to put a housing development there when there's going to be so much objection locally? So what happened is plans were put in for an industrial area, an industrial park, for much needed industry. And then the developer got one of these change agents along, and this is in the 1980s, to start a protest group to protest against this industrial area, because we need houses more than an industrial area. And surprise, surprise, the council gave a lending ear and they opposed the industrial area, but they thought the best option is then to have housing. Now, what they did, they just manipulated the way people were thinking. And that was way back in the 80s. Now, I don't know what Curtin and Company are doing round here. I really don't know. There's a lot of hearsay and that. But if you look on the page, the council page, Broxman Council, look at their planning page, on the 11th of May, 30 template letters were sent in with different addresses on them, promoting and praising the new development. Now, wouldn't you think that's a little bit suspicious? All on the same day? Template letters.
They're all very similar as well, and some of the quotes on there are laughable. They're actually laughable what these people are saying. You know,
That's
they're
right.
saying,
Well, it's
well,
not gonna bother me.
I've got no objection. I think it's great. I was worried about the traffic, but I don't think that'll be a problem either. Now, the whole point, as we talked about before the show, Chris, was that these are planning applications, yeah?
Yeah.
About planning. So the only reason that you write in is if you want to object. You don't go patting them on the back, do you?
Well, precisely. I mean, the only time you normally get people wanting it patted on the back is when there is, shall we say, financial interests. And often developers will get a councillor to send in and say, oh, yes, I think it's a jolly good development. But that's just 1 or 2 letters. Never 30 letters on exactly the same day. It just doesn't make... I mean, I can't accuse, I don't know if it's Curtin and Company, because I've got no evidence. But it seems very strange. You know, and it's what has really amazed me, though, is that what happened about 2 years ago, or a couple of years ago, compared with now. And I'm finding that some people are crossing the road to avoid me. They seem embarrassed. And the chief objectors a few years ago, they haven't bothered either. And the attitude is, oh, what can you do? Oh, it's a sort of... And if you say anything like, for instance, what you were saying earlier, they say, oh, it's a conspiracy. You know, I read the local... I read a tabloid newspaper. I know exactly what's going on, and I watch the BBC. You know, I know I'm fully genned on what's happening. And I've noticed that when you're talking about facts, you're giving facts to them, they kind of go into a kind of dreamlike state. And even if you do it, trying to do it with comedy, they're still in this kind of, oh, what can you do? I don't know what to do. And I find it quite disturbing. It's a bit like, what's that, the Stepford Wives? The sort of people are walking around like a dream.
Except they're all Stepford people.
Yes. Yeah. It's bizarre. I think what's happened is over the years we've had so many of these applications put in and turned down and put in and turned down that they've just been worn down by it. That's, I feel, is the real fact of the matter. But really, I did some digging into the local council, and they actually have a business. In fact, the local Citizens Advice around here is actually a business. It's a limited company, and you can actually check this out. Dun and Bradstreet, and you can look at Company's House. But I found that the local council has a company called Badger BC Investments Limited. And then when you look, I'll just read out a little extract from what they say. They say, the company will invest primarily, but not necessarily extensively, in a variety of residential properties, where it is in the company's commercial interest to do so, and which maximises the return for the council. This will involve the acquisition of existing flats or housing, buildings which could be converted to residential use, and the development of sites for residential purposes. So how can, when you put your object to anything in planning, how can it be neutral when it's in the local council's interests to make a profit out of it? Just doesn't make sense, you know. And then when you look at other things, I mean, the council is going to make a heck of a lot of money out of this development, because when you think each property, well, first of all, the planning process generates about £17,420 for the authority. Then there's a thing called Section 106. And that stipulates that there is a one-off fee of £3,000 per additional bedroom on new developments that's to be paid by the developer. So it's very lucrative for the council, isn't it? And then on completion of properties, there's an additional council tax of, say, £2,000 per household per annum. Again, very lucrative. And then, of course, you've got this Badger BC Investments Limited. So really, when you look at it, it's hypocrisy. And then I dug a little bit further. I looked back in newspapers and I found out that a lot of developers, I'm not blaming the developer around here, there's not at all, it's the developers, have actually given the Tory party, where was this now? Here it is. They've been given millions. This was in the Daily Telegraph, and it says, Conservatives given millions by property developers. And that was in 2011. People can look this up themselves. And
yes, and we've got to remember also that there seems to be a revolving door of these council employees into these private developer companies. You know, these private companies are getting involved with the council. Next thing, you find that your local council has left and he's got a lucrative job with them, or your local planning officer. They're all involved, and this is what we found out in London. Very, very concentrated in that you've got all these people who have basically been bought off, and we were trying to find out what the incentives were. You don't really have to look very hard, because you can see it all over the place. There was a case recently of somebody who'd been promoted into one of these companies, someone in local government. But or just search it and you'll find loads of examples of this. It's kind of mind-boggling to the extent that we've covered it on so many shows. And it's a bit like you're saying, Chris, that nobody is really that interested. They don't really get it, because what this relies on is the public being very small-minded. So they just think of their own little part of the world. You know, as Bonzo Dog Band said, my pink half of the drain pipe. You know, I can't see any further than that. You know, you've painted slightly over my side of the drain pipe. I'm going to actually paint over your paint so I can have my bit of the drain pipe back. This is the sort of mentality, and the not in my backyard thing that they always go on about. But it's quite incredible, because when I saw this stuff happening in Waltham Forest and the corruption there, you could blatantly see it, who was involved and who wasn't. And the change agents who came in, the revolving door at the council, who was getting the kickbacks. And, of course, nobody there believed that was going to be like an open concentration camp, which it is. But the plan for these out-of-town places is slightly different than that, isn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, you know, it's done very stealthily, very, very, very quiet. I mean, round here we've got speed humps in areas where there's no property. Why? It's ridiculous. And I mean, for example, you were talking about councillors. Now, councillors can be involved. They can be directors of local authority companies, and not have to claim that, put that down on their outside interests. And that I know for a fact that's actually happened. So you'll have a councillor who's a director of a local authority business, and then you look up, see what their outside interests are, and it's blank. And you say, well, hang on a minute, if they're a director of a local authority company, sure, they should put that down. They say, oh, no. Don't have to, because it's local authority. So they've found a loophole. And I found, because I looked this up and I thought, hang on a minute, this councillor's wrong, or that councillor's wrong. And then I contacted a friend of mine. She is an ex-councillor, but she told the truth and got booted out. And she said, no, that's perfectly acceptable. That's what they can do. So why can't they put it down? Was to me, if it's a limited company, sure, it's an outside interest. I mean, I didn't vote for that company. I don't know whether they're using our money to start it up. I don't know. But it sounds very, very interesting. Sorry, you gave me a question. I haven't answered it. What was that, Mark? Sorry.
It's okay. I think you broadly answered it there, Chris, because we went slightly off the subject. But I've just been looking at planninghelp.org.uk. This is your guide to local planning. And we've talked about how these groups are controlled. You just referred to it a while ago. From the 80s, you were saying this has happened, that they created the control group, and of course they gave the people what they thought the people thought they wanted. So they created an opposition group that was going to lose, and they managed to defeat the opposition group. So they had a great victory there, didn't they? So we've got here campaign tips. Listen how patronising this is, but this is what they're doing. They're controlling the narrative in these areas. There's called a managed decline or a managed retreat. Managed retreat is when they're getting people away from the sea because, heaven forbid, in 100 years it may have risen 3 metres. It didn't rise 1 metre after the last ice age, but they never seem to even bother about facts because we're in the post-truth world, aren't we? So it doesn't really matter. So they scare people, and we had the world leading expert in sea levels, Niels Axel Morner, actually saying he was going to Fairburn in Wales. He said, if you want a court case, I will support you. And they had the campaign group there, and it was Action for Fairburn or something. I thought, this is a controlled opposition group set up by the council. And I sent the solution. I said, this man wants to represent you in your court case. He will win. He is the world's leading expert on sea levels. You do not need to move out of there. We can find in these. I think that the save all the people's houses would be jumping at that, but no, they didn't. I posted it all over their Facebook links, But as you're saying, there seems to be a kind of, it's not even a resigned acceptance. It's kind of a blindness to what's going on. But it says here, for instance, it says campaign tips. Whatever you care about, it is almost certain that there are other people who feel the same way. Working together with like-minded people is the best way to have a voice on issues that affect your lives, whether you want to save your local park or change national planning legislation. Community action can be the best way to achieve your aim. Now, never get involved with a so-called community group because they're always controlled opposition. So you have to create your own, and you have to know everybody in it. But it says, we have put together a range of resources to help you plan an effective campaign. Communicate your message and gather people to your cause. And it's got all the articles, how you deal with it all, planning your campaign. And it goes, identify campaign opportunities. It is important to pick an issue that would make a good campaign. Well, the whole point of having a campaign is to you know what your issue is going to be from the start, isn't it?
Well, precisely.
You don't just go, let's have a campaign about something and find something to campaign about. There's usually a defining moment where you go, I object to this. It says actions by a public or corporate body which people feel is wrong, a threat to people's way of life and the things they care about, solutions or remedies which are politically attractive to decision makers. Before devoting time and money to a campaign, you should assess the idea. How much of a priority is this issue? Can you afford not to get involved? And is the trade-off with other priorities worth it? Do you have the resources to run an effective campaign? If not, how can you get them? Well, of course, we can help you. Does your group have credibility with the people who will take the decisions and the ability to influence them? Well, it doesn't matter because we're going to put in the people who will influence them and will make the decisions. What are your chances of success? None if you get involved with the council, right? That's what happened in Waltham Forest. The local architect actually redesigned the one-way system, which was blocking all the roads, and it was binned. And, of course, they never even referred to his document. And the people who were brought into the area, after it had all been implemented, were never seen again.
Isn't that amazing? But by the way, if I could cut in there, you're saying
yes, please.
About them blocking off turnings and things like that. I remember my father used to drive to work. I was brought up in North London, and he used to drive through Finsbury Park. And I remember in the 60s, he said, they're blocking off all the side roads, he said, and it's causing absolute mayhem with the traffic, and that was in the 60s. So it started, I think, way back in the 60s, because I personally believe that we lost the Cold War. And when I say that, people love, oh, come on, we saw the Berlin Wall come down. But when you look at Stalin, he wanted to control the West. And he knew militarily he'd never be able to do it. But he got the Tavistock Centre to, not Tavistock Centre, the Frankfurt School, to look into ideological subversion. And when you go onto YouTube, you can actually see a chap called Yuri Brezmenov.
Yeah, we've featured him on the show quite a few times.
Yeah, And he says you've got to, he said how subversion is in 4 stages. And all you have to do is take the bananas out your ears and just look to see what's happening. And it's so blatantly obvious. But he said you bombard people with loads of information, truth, lies, so they can, and then demoralise them to such a state that they can't make any rational decision. So then you could sort of say or do anything and they'll just go that way. And I think this is where we're at, because first of all, in the 70s, we started with the demoralisation, and next we're going to go to destabilisation, then crisis, and the end result is what they call it. I can't remember the word now. Because there's 4 basic stages in subversion. Normalisation is the last part. And that's sarcastic.
Right.
Because that's
destabilisation is the first one.
Actually, I think the first one is anything goes. That's why, because it's to destroy the family unit is the first thing to do.
Yes, yeah.
Destroy the family unit, and then destroy, I'm not religious, but destroy religion, because that usually keeps communities together. So you destroy religion, then destroy places of meeting like pubs and places like that, which they're doing. And then you go on to the next stage, which is demoralisation, and that is high unemployment, mass immigration, which is really bad for the immigrant as well as the indigenous, because it's really saying that the immigrant's culture is not worth anything and the indigenous culture is not worth anything, so we're just going to muddle it all together. And really, we're all being used as pawns. That's the real facts of the matter. But again, if you look at ideological subversion, and it starts off with the Prodigals of Zion, the original that was written in, I believe, in the 1830s or 40s, and then the Frankfurt School used that as a kind of blueprint to then work out how they was going to subvert the West. And they did it absolutely perfectly. As Yuri Brezhnev said, he said, it's better than they could have ever dreamt of. And you've only got to sit down and watch the BBC one evening and you'll see how subverted our society is. So in one sense, I'm shocked the way people are behaving, but in another sense, well, I think I understand why, because they just can't make any rational decision. They're just completely bombarded with drivel all the time. And that's it.
Yeah, that's right. And there's the other way they do it, which is to give the 2 lies. So basically, you're just going between 2 competing lies.
Yeah.
So you've got lie 1 and lie 2, and they put the public in between them, and they put themselves between the truth and the lies. So they control the truth. And this is very, very easy to work out once you realise the template. And it's like all of these things. All of these people are working to a template. But I'd just like to read something out, which I found, which is the preface to Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals. And let's just see what he says. Lest we forget, at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical from all our legends, mythology and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which. The first radical known to man, effectively, that he at least won his own kingdom, was Lucifer, Saul Alinsky. So that's how he starts his book off, so it's quite interesting. And then it goes into revolutionary, how to be a revolutionary. But this is really interesting because when they talk about revolutionaries, it kind of appeals to people, doesn't it? Oh, I like the sound of that. But what they're talking about is communist subversion. And basically, as Yuri Bezmenov says, yes, of course, the useful idiots are the first to go. And we're talking about that. People may think, what's the connection here? But the connection is really how this is being enforced. It's being enforced with no choice, but with the appearance of choice. And it's how it's being done. And we've talked about this for weeks, haven't we, Tony? We've been going on about the cult of narcissism, political correctness, the way that things are subverted by equality and social justice being the refuge of the useful idiot and the clever tyrant. So equality and social justice, that is so-called. Equality is not a given. If all men are created equal, then they should be judged only by their actions for proof of equality. So equality can only be judged if there's a standard for it. There's no standard for equality, which is why there is none. So there's no equality. So when they talk about equality, they're talking about the removal of any form of anything that could be considered to make people equal. So that's a good way to sort of finish the first part of the show. And when we get back into it, we're going to come back with Chris and Tony and talk about how this is affecting you, because that's what this show's about. It's about how we're all affected by the global action plan implemented locally. We'll break whenever you're ready, Tony.
Right, welcome back to Windows on the World Live, Part 2. That second tune you heard there was from our friend and fellow host, sometimes guest, Unique Lee. And you can find more of his music and his excellent video productions on minds.com/Unique Lee. Check that out. Right, so all fully refreshed, gentlemen, ready to go, Part 2?
Yes, Tony, and I think we should let Chris go into what he was going to talk about, his points. I think it's 25 points, is it, Chris?
That's right, yeah. Well, no, it's a 25 page, not necessarily 25 points as such.
Right, okay.
My aim for this was, I thought that I'd put this out. I put it in very early because I knew this submission was coming. It took me quite a bit of time to get all this information together, and most of it was from memory, basically, because I work in architecture, so I just sort of pulled bits out from experience and that. And I thought people would look at this and go, he's got a point here. Because there's loads and loads of points I've raised, like about the first garden cities and all different things like that. And nobody has actually read it. When I say nobody, all right, okay, the officials have, local council and no doubt the planners and people like that. But I mean, I'm in a difficult position because a neighbour of mine I get on very, very well with. They're very nice people, but they are selling their land for this development because they're going to make some money out of it. And it puts me in a difficult position because I'm really good friends. They've been very good to me. And I just faced them and just said, no, look, I'm not going to do anything underhanded. I don't approve of this development going ahead. And I'll say it straight to your face, and I'll be very straight to you, that, I'm going to object to the development. But then what happened is the newspaper printed, extracts from this, what I wrote, and they thought I'd gone to the newspapers. Well, I hadn't, because the newspapers actually approached me, because my attitude towards newspapers is if you go into the mainstream press, it not only destroys your credibility, but I don't really want anything to do with them, because most of the time journalists haven't got to get everything wrong, and I just don't trust them. I just do not. And if I went to the press at all, I certainly wouldn't go to the Daily Mirror or the Sun or anything like that.
No, but it's quite helpful that they printed your article there, because obviously, like we said in the first half, it brought things of great importance to the public attention, even if they didn't realise that it was important, or even if they weren't paying attention.
Oh yeah, I mean, give them Joe. I mean, the journalist was very pleasant. There's no ifs and buts or anything like that. I think he did a pretty good job, So give him Joe. But there's lots of situations. I mean, going through what I actually wrote. I mean, I've sat through so many council meetings. I know their questions. I know how they put things. And what they do, they sort of stand there with this. If you're talking to, say, not all, but some local councils, they've got this sort of attitude that what they say is 100% true. Like, we're living longer, that's why we need the houses. No, we're not living any longer. I mean, are we living to 120? There's no real scientific evidence that we are living any longer. In fact, I don't think we are living in any longer. The other thing is the increase in population. Well, the indigenous population, if you go on to YouTube, and he's been on television, there's a famous, what is he now? Not a statistician, population expert. He's also a doctor, and I'm just trying to find him now because I can't remember his name. His name is Professor Hans Rosling. And he looks at populations, and he's shown that the indigenous European population is absolutely nosediving. it's dropping. They knew
plummeted, absolutely plummeted from the 1800s. You can see a graph, and I use it in one of my talks. I think I gave a copy to Sandy, who was on the other week, because she'd never seen it before. It was a Centre for Population Control, and it's absolutely plummeted shockingly. So you're right. All this stuff about overpopulation's rubbish. What they're doing is they're bringing in more people. That doesn't mean that you've got a population problem. It means you've got an immigration problem.
And I mean,
well, of course, that's hate speak and that's racist. You know, the facts are hatred, you see, and you're not allowed to say that. So we're so bound by political correctness that you can't even get any of the lies out because they're just between you can't get the truth out because they're between the two lies of Soviet subversion. So you've got two competing lies, like you've got the far right and the extreme left, neither of which really exist.
That's right. And also, what they're doing is cheaper to get a doctor from overseas that's been trained overseas than to train an indigenous European doctor. And what's happening, it's starving third world countries of much needed doctors and the people, the intellectuals and the educated people that could build those countries up, because those countries are being starved because they're coming to Europe. And this is, there's 101 other things. Mainly it's the IMF who's starving these countries of finance and etc. That's another subject. But it's all lopsided in order to reach the objective of what they really want is, 90% of the population wiped off the face of the earth.
Well, they talk about 80%, and that's in their documents. And you can actually see that in the Agenda 21 plans. It's all kind of written out. And, of course, Bill Gates saying that they can reduce the population through vaccination. That's in one of his speeches on TED Talk. But you were going to go into your points there, Chris, I think.
Well, the thing is, I've been at lots of meetings, and there's these, I think it's, these people go on courses, and one of the most common statements I've heard is from the council is, the housing development is only a small percentage of the borough. You have lots of green space left. What are you complaining about? Local woods will still be there, along with lots of other green spaces. I've had that said to me umpteen times. It's nonsense. Complete nonsense. The other one is, we're only building on 5% of the land. But they don't say 5% this week, today, next week. You add that up, it's more than 5%. And they make these statements as if they are so 100%. And if you answer them, they don't hear you. They have selective hearing. They just sort of look over you. And I've noticed a lot of meetings, not necessarily at my local council, because I've been to meetings at other councils that I've been involved with, and you notice that a lot of these kind of subversion agents, they pick on the people that are a little bit dumb, a little bit dim, and they try and push anybody that is starting to ask some real questions out the way, because they want to aim towards the people that don't really understand the planning procedure and that. Now, this is one of the reasons why I did this 25-page document, because I wanted to give people an idea of what planning's about in a funny sort of way and show them what is exactly happening. But again, if nobody reads it, I'm wasting my time. But, I pointed out other things here, like, for instance, they always say, just think of the advantage of this development. We work closely with the developer to ensure it has minimum impact on the local community. That's another one to come out with.
That's great, that one, yeah.
Or, you should contact your local MP if you feel strongly about this. What's he going to do?
Well, exactly. This is the point, that they always send you off in the wrong direction.
That's
so
right.
That's a time-wasting exercise. That's basically to demoralise you. If you go to your local MP about anything important, you will be demoralised. That's the whole purpose.
Oh, that's right. We desperately need affordable homes and jobs for local people, key workers. This is what the housing development will bring. Well, if you look around where I live, it's all these gated communities. Have you seen them? Where
Yes.
You have about 4 or 5 houses, or perhaps half a dozen houses, and they have to have like a sort of a pass to get in to this gated area. It's like Fort Knox. Well, not as bad as that, but and there's loads of them. They're not just one or two. They're doing it everywhere because obviously the crime rate's going to go through the roof.
That's the idea, and that's the whole plan, is to increase the crime in cities so that everybody wants to live behind gates. Everyone thinks that eye scanners are a good idea. Everyone just wants their gym, their mini Tesco, and their key fob or their eye scanner. And they're going to say, yeah, but look what's out there. It's chaos. And that's the whole point of it. And that's the whole paradigm of what Agenda 21's about. They're bringing in fear, and they're going to create the fear and create the threat. So they're using this Saul Alinsky model to actually terrorize people and get them into a point of submission. And I saw this happening in Waltham Forest, for instance, when they created this new village area and they brought these yuppies and hipsters in, and the property prices went through the roof and they started closing the roads off. It became like an exclusive area. And then they're saying, should we have gates on it? And what you have now is at the top of the road where there was a lot of the poorer little shops, and you never really noticed any divide there before, but you're starting to see it. And you're starting to see resentment, and that's what it's all about. The whole point of this new communitarianism is not about everybody living together. It's about creating fracture points within society to bring in the solution, which is iron fist control. That's all it is. And it's not going to be any different out of town. They want people locked in their little places, not going to any pubs, having a community hub, which is a place where you often find little old ladies working in the voluntary sector, which is the biggest growth industry because it's not an industry. So you get everybody working for nothing. That's a big part of the agenda. This global action plan is to get people impoverished so that they're happy just to have some job which will bring in some money, which just basically keeps a roof over their head. What I was going to ask you, though, Chris, is these new developments that are being built in places like Hertfordshire, these are quite big properties. Who's going to buy them?
We've lost Chris from the line. Hopefully we'll get him back in a sec. He looks like he's lost his connection.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Question now, who is going to buy them?
Exactly. This is something that I find very, very interesting because I've started seeing a lot of this going on, as we started to say in the beginning of the show. I think Martin was talking about it happening in his area before he moved. And these little villages I used to go to, especially in places like Hertfordshire and all these surrounding... basically, we're talking about Greater London now. London's got bigger and bigger. And there's a lot of properties like this being built in Kent. You know, there's lots of places in Kent that you're getting these quite big houses being built. And you're just wondering, these seem to be being bought by people with a few quid. You know, they're not really for people who are actually in the area. That's the interesting thing. It's like they're bringing in people who are moving out and they can afford to. But again, it's not really been thought through. The whole of this infrastructure hasn't been thought through. There's no way it can really work. And that's where I was going to talk to Chris again about it. But getting back into all of the stuff that we've talked about for months and months on end. We've done so many shows on this and how council's going against people's real opinions and then controlling the narrative. So everybody must really be seeing it. And I don't think that the stuff that Chris is saying is going to be alien to anybody. What I'm interested in finding out, though, is that if anybody else out there is seeing this dumbing down and this acquiescence from any kind of responsibility or opinion that people seem to be having. How's it going down your way for that, Tony? Have you noticed more zombies, or is there just the same amount as normal?
I think it's pretty much the same. Not much changes. I think the comment we had earlier about people living in the hamster wheel and do they get afraid when the cage door opens and all that, I think there's truth in that for sure. People are happy in their little cosy worlds, and again, as I've said many times now, it's only adversity that makes people do anything at all, wakes them up in any way. And all the time, while we've still got the majority of the population able to pay their bills, they're struggling to do that, aren't they? They're distracted by it all, and they just want an easy, simple life. They want to get on with it. They don't want that cage door opened and that crazy new world that we keep talking about. You know, they don't want that to become their reality. Once they start looking into it and accepting it, and having to do something about it, their whole reality's changed, and they're reluctant to do that.
Exactly. It goes back to what we were saying about that Aldous Huxley quote. I think I've said it a few times, Tony. There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies, so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution. Yeah, we said that a couple of weeks ago, but I like mentioning that quote because he said it at some event in 1962, and he obviously knew what was coming. And the 60s was the beginning of a lot of this social engineering, really, even though, of course, it started at the beginning of the century. But when we go into what's happening now, there is generally a 30-year kind of workup with a lot of these plans, and then you've got 2 generations to subvert. So we've got at least 2 generations that have been subverted. Again, what we were talking about through Common Core education. And we find now that people in their 50s have problems with their kids because their kids are so dumbed down and they're so compliant that the 50-year-olds are going, what's the matter with you? Have you got no life left in you? And this is very worrying. But yet these places are being built for them, and this is the sort of thing that only people who like freedom, you see, we're talking about collectivism here, aren't we? We're talking about people who want to be part of a collective. And I'm an individual like you and like many other people who come on the show. Now, individual doesn't mean that you're selfish. It means that you like to have and support other people's rights. You like having rights yourself, but you respect and support other people's. Now, collectivism is actually about not respecting anyone's rights. It's actually having the state granting you rights, and the state shouldn't be there to grant us our rights. Our rights are inalienable, and that's where all of this comes from. I'm looking at this council thing here, what they're saying. I mean, it's so patronising. Why are we listening to these overpaid bureaucrats who are absolutely thick, most of them? And I'm not being prejudiced here. They are thick, and they're very devious, and they like lying to people. So that's the problem we've got is big local government. We need small local government, not big local government. So like I keep reiterating, the way to do it is form real community, just people that you know. And people can subvert this stuff. And I think that's what they should be doing. And we've now got this Saul Alinsky rules for radicals, which is basically by this vile, evil communist, Saul Alinsky. But what they're doing is they're even subverting the rules for radicals. So in other words, there's nothing that's not off the charts. And we did this show last week. I put it up, Tony. I haven't mentioned it. It was called UK's British Army Trolls, and it was about the 7-7 Brigade, which is basically controlling the narrative on Facebook and Twitter. But the thing is about that, it just draws into the bigger picture of what they're doing on every level. And the reason 7-7 Brigade and the army trolls haven't really worked is because we've got councils doing it all day long, and they're much more skilled at it than the British Army. So psychological subversion and the MOD are probably a bit old-fashioned now. It's more like sort of Dad's Army, as I said, than kind of sophisticated Israeli intelligence subversion techniques. So we're seeing more subversion from the military-industrial complex in these sort of local groups and local councils and change agent groups and organisations. They are actually really controlling the narrative, and it goes through everything. It's just like they're telling you now how to actually plan your campaign. I mean, this is so ridiculous. So the council are telling you how to protest against the council, and I don't know how successful any of this stuff is, because I don't really know anybody that looks at these websites apart from me. And the only reason I look at them is to see the kind of subversion techniques they're using. So I'm not really sure who uses this stuff apart from the change agents that they employ. And, of course, there's increasing numbers of them. Have we got Chris back yet, or is he still... Oh, it looks like he's back online.
Yep, here he is. I don't know whether we'll be able to get him in the call, though. I might have to drop it, because if he's still on his Linux, let's see.
All right then, Tony.
He's coming, hopefully.
I'm back on.
Yeah, here we go.
Sorry.
Welcome back, Chris.
I don't know what happened. I did a very technical thing. I unplugged it and plugged it back in again, the router, and it worked. It just went.
Well, that's handy.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry about that, fellas. I've had to reboot the computer and everything. It often does that. It just sort of dies and then comes back again. But oh well, as I say. But where was we? I missed it when I've lost about 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, so I was just recapping, really, and going on about things that we've been going on about for some time, but which need reiterating. And basically the pharmacological concentration camp, asking whether Tony had seen a rise in zombies around the South End area, and he said there's no more than usual. So then we went into the Saul Alinsky rules for radicals being used, and also that the military-industrial complex and the MOD and their army trolls have been surpassed by local councils.
And you had
with their military intelligence techniques.
You had a question for Chris, didn't you? Just as he went, you was asking him who he thinks he's going to buy those houses.
Yes, exactly. So these new developments that are being built, and I've seen them, these things on the outskirts of London, and some of them are quite big, the houses. They're not just little two up, two downs. And they're like these little boxes. They're sort of horrible modern houses that I'd hate to live in because they all have their little uniform garden. They're the sort of houses that make me instantly depressed. They've got the car on the drive, and they're all the same. They may have the mock Georgian pillars, these horrible, characterless drone houses. But, Chris, the question is, who buys them?
Well, it's these sort of, what I've noticed, it appears to be two types of people. There seems to be type of people that are at home all day, got pots of money, but you don't know how they got lots of money. And they've got their big flash car, which they keep outside.
Yes.
As a kind of, look at me, look at my car. But the men are never at work, so you don't know what they do. Your guess is about as good as mine. And I've noticed that when Britain gave up Hong Kong, or when it was transfer happened with Hong Kong, there's a lot of people from Hong Kong that's come here, and they seem to have filtered into the area. Not that many, quite a few. They're rich anyway, but it is a mystery who can afford them, because they're like mini mansions, but they're a cramped space. They're all on top of each other. Now, I really don't know who can afford them, because they're so expensive. I mean, and everybody's got the latest BMW stuck outside, or the latest Merc, but there's no, you go down the local high street on a weekday and you see these fellas walking around. They don't seem to what do they do for a living? It's a mystery.
Yeah, that's something that I've noticed too, and I think it's a very odd phenomenon, actually, because if I had a load of money, I wouldn't live in a place like that. I'd go and get somewhere with a bit of land around it, or I'd live somewhere more exciting, like in a city. I suppose if they've got kids, they're thinking about the schools, But this is another thing, is how does this thrive as a community? These housing developments, they're not communities, are they? They're just kind of like, it's like having loads of, we all know what Brookside Close looks like. I think it's the last time I watched telly, actually, when I was up. But these sort of modern developments, these characterless modern developments that are quite big, yes, and I've noticed that they don't have any visible signs of income. You actually wonder what they do. So you used to see around Walthamstow, you'd see a lot of self-employed people, painters and decorators, builders, with their vans, and what they did for a living. But those people seem to have gone. It seems to be, I think this is a general thing. It's been replaced by people who don't really seem to have proper jobs.
That's right. It's a complete and utter mystery, unless they work on the internet or something like that. But the usual thing is, when you try and find out what these people do, it's usually either in IT, that's the usual one, or public relations. They're the two mystery jobs that seem to give a lot of money, but you can sit on your backside all day at home. They're two mystery jobs. What in IT and what in public relations do they do? But one thing I was going to say, do you know what politicians actually praised Saul Alinsky? And there's proof of this. One is David Cameron, and the other is Obama.
Right. Yes, because Obama started the community organisers in America, and that was the big thing. It's basically like he got criticised because it was like an army. He was trying to create this communitarian army.
That's right.
And it was done like an army, like a communist army. well, of course, Obama's a communist. He came from a communist background. He's trained as a communist. And you say that to people, they laugh at you. Think, Obama, what, the first black president was a communist? Yes.
Well, look,
and they missed the point entirely. But Cameron, you've got a very good point. Cameron's Big Society in 2011, he announced that he was going to be using Saul Alinsky rules for radicals. The Big Society got loads of lottery money, and that's where all these change agent groups came from. Organisations such as Unlimited, Locality, Intentionality, BigSociety.org, all these community interest companies, and the social entrepreneurs, training social entrepreneurs. These people, again, Chris, are people that I've seen, these organisers. They, again, have a lot of money. They go into areas and they take over. They become, all of a sudden, the hub of the community. But they weren't there 5 minutes ago. They just arrived, and they're very pushy, very belligerent, take over. Those are a lot of the people. So I suppose some of them could be change agents. What do you think about that, Chris?
Quite possibly. But what people don't realise, when they go move into these big executive houses, or whatever you call them, is that they think it's all been architect designed, and but spec builders and developers, the design period is an overhead, and they're there to make money. So The design period is cut as short as humanly possible. So generally, in most spec builders, they might have an architect and several technicians, because the architect is really the overall manager, and the technicians are the people that make sure the building is put together. They do the design drawings. The architects do as well. And I've got a sort of funny story about a developer that I was on freelance, and it was a time when there was not much work around. This was in the 1980s. And a contract, I'll be brief on this, the contract came up for a developer. Now, my background is industrial and commercial. I don't normally deal with housing, but, any port in a storm, and there's a little bit of money coming in, so I thought, right, I'll go for it. And I went to this developer, and the first day I went in there, and the senior architect was a chain smoker. He's smoking up, and everything is absolutely stressed. Everybody's stressed out of their mind. You can almost sense it when you walk in the door. But anyway, I needed to go to the loo, open the door, the loo. I stood there with the door open. If I could try and explain it, there's this sort of room, and the staircase, the underside of the staircase, came across the room. So to get to the urinal, you had to be a limbo dancer. I mean, how'd you get there? And I stood there, I thought, how am I going to relieve myself? And suddenly a bloke walked past, he saw me with the door open, he said, excuse me, mate, you're new here, aren't you? I said, yeah. He said, no, you pee in the sink, and if you need to go anything further, you go out to the public toilets over the road. And this is how what it was is the spec builders built their own building, but they'd done it so fast that they couldn't think it through. So, they decided that because the staircase came across the toilet, they couldn't put an ordinary toilet bowl there because you wouldn't be able to lift the lid because it had hit against the underside of the staircase. So they put a urinal there, but you still couldn't get to it. You had to be a limbo dancer. And that was a real sort of developer. And when you go down and look at their showroom, people being shown around this marvellous architect-designed area. No, people in spec builders are generally ink slappers. They're doing it so fast you haven't got time to think. And I lasted about 3 days. I couldn't handle it. I almost had a nervous breakdown. But this is the myth that's put over. And when you look at a lot of these houses, to say that they're designed, no, what it really is cramming as much as possible onto a small amount of space. And that's really
this has been part of the plans. I mean, it's called high-density housing, as you know, and it's especially prevalent in London. What they're doing with the council estates, they're pulling all the council houses down. Well, Architects for Social Housing said that they could actually rebuild with high density, leaving the existing structures there so nobody would lose their lifelong tenancies. Of course, they didn't want that. They want to destroy the lifelong tenancies by pulling the building. And so you've got these hive housing places now where the flats are really, really tiny and they're like too small. So people are getting used to living in a space that's slightly too small for them. And that just causes kind of stress, really. You see that with these little flats, and they're getting people just to accept less and less space.
Well, I'll let you into a little secret there.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across.
Carry on, Chris, yeah.
But a developer that will remain nameless, for obvious reasons, that I work for, shall we say, the one with the funny urinal, they actually employed a carpenter to go to their show homes and buy standard flat pack furniture and shorten the furniture. So they'd shorten a bed and make the furniture smaller, so it made the rooms look bigger. So people are going, oh, that's a nice bed. So where a bed would be, I don't know, 6 foot, he would cut it down to about just under 5 foot and make it narrower. And just enough so you wouldn't sort of notice it, but you would only notice it when you get another bed in. And that's what they used to do. It's a bit like, in the cowboy films, they make used to make the sets small so the cowboys look big. And this is what the spec builders do. But what I was going to say is that one of the first satellite towns from London was what's that place north
Milton
of
Keynes?
No, not Milton Keynes. No, it was Letchworth Garden City.
Yes.
Letchworth Garden City, and the average was 17 homes per hectare, and that was in about 1907. Okay. Nowadays, now remember that number, 17 homes per hectare. Nowadays, it's 45 to 50 homes per hectare, and that is increasing to 100 homes per hectare. And that is a genuine fact. In London, it is 100 homes per hectare.
This brings us into something else, Chris, I wanted to ask you about. They're saying we need all these new houses being built, that there's a housing shortage. What's your opinion on this? Because I've got my own opinion.
Well, it's not a shortage. It's a deliberate shortage. You can create a shortage. If you want to raise the price of something, you create a shortage. Now, first of all, look, we know what is happening in London. They're making these areas where investors are coming into London. They're knocking down the council houses. You did a programme on this. So where are the locals to go? They have to go to the suburbs, because what's happening is foreign investors are coming in and they're buying up properties in London. And if you go around London, most places are a ghost town because they're leaving them there as an investment.
Yes, almost 40% of properties in Kensington and Chelsea have been sold to overseas buyers, and they're proportionately empty. So this is also happening in the Bankside development. I think that was 40% was just bought by shelf companies when that went up. This is, of course, the sort of thing that the puppet Sadiq Khan is in on, and he actually voted for a full demolition model of all the council estates. He was in the developers' pockets from the start. That's why he got in. The City of London wanted him in there because they made so much money, and of course he's a compromised puppet. But
that's right.
That's really what's going on. So
if you go to the
this housing shortage thing, yes, they're creating.
Sorry, I'm talking across you. Sorry, Mark. Carry on. Sorry.
No, it's all right. They create the artificial scarcity, like you're saying, but out of thin air, basically. And then, of course, there's a housing shortage. Well, this is where these satellite places, like you're talking about, and places like where you're in Hertford, are very interesting to me, because we've already discussed that the infrastructure isn't really there to support that amount of people, but also who's moving in there. So it's not the area that needs the housing, is it? It's not the actual area. The people who live in the in the county that need the housing. This is what I'm trying to get to.
Well, that's right. Did you know there's now, according to the Office of National Statistics, you look this up, there's 1 million homes that are empty in this country. 1 million. And according to the Daily Mirror, it says that there's 10 empty homes for every homeless family. So that's the old story. You create a shortage, you create a problem that doesn't exist.
Absolutely. Yeah, that really ties in with what I see as well and what we've been talking about for a long time on this show. Because London is very, very populated, people think there's this massive shortage, and it's artificial. It's absolutely artificial. There's a lot more people leaving London. Of course, you're going to get a lot more immigrants coming in because they're looking for work. But that doesn't mean that there's necessarily a housing shortage. I mean, this is where it all gets very interesting, because these developments that are going on everywhere out of town, again, it's a mystery to me. It's actually a bit of a mystery, because it's nothing to do with supplying. It's not supplying. They're not supplying anything. They're just building them.
Yeah. And when you look at housing, I mean, just look at a house, and if you went back 100 years, or say we got a builder from 100 years ago and brought him to the future to now, they would, apart from the mechanisation, they would find their way around a building site with relative ease. I mean, what is a house? I mean, it's bricks, yeah, they're mentioned in the Bible. When you look at technology, it hasn't advanced much with housing. Why? How comes with cars, we know the technology is advanced, aircraft is advanced, not with housing?
Well, most buildings gone backwards, it hasn't gone forwards.
Precisely. Yeah, you got it in one there, Tony, because really your environment, they found that when they cut trees down, the environment becomes more aggressive. Because when you think about it, for thousands of years we lived in woods, we lived in little communities that were natural communities, and we looked after each other. But they think by plonking loads and loads of strangers into an area, it then becomes an artificial community and everything's rosy and fantastic. But it doesn't work like that, because what you'll find, I think what they want is a bit like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, where you've got the workers over there and then the elite rich in London, and the workers that come in do their jobs for the elite rich and then out again. And I think that's what they're offering, because, I mean, near where I live, there was some houses going up and they was building them next to pigsties. This was about 10 years ago. And, you know, people said, well, what about the smell? I said, well, the pigs will get used to it. But I'm sorry, that's a terrible joke. But that was true. There was actually building these executive homes next to piggeries. And the stench was awful, and people were still buying the property. It's an investment. But again, there were mystery people. Where did they get the money from? This is just a big, big mystery.
Can I interject here with something that kind of links up? When I was a kid, my old man used to take us down to Cornwall and Devon and out on holiday, and you could buy a house down there then for peanuts, like literally. Yeah. You couldn't give them away. And I know you two gentlemen will be well aware, and so most of our listeners, but it ties in very nicely with what you're saying here, the safety deposit box homes. It started a long, long time ago, and it weren't the foreigners that started it. It was actually the people that live here, the people from up country, as they got called down there. And I actually lived in Cornwall for 8 years, and I see massive changes that happened down there as a result of what was going on with people buying houses that they wasn't living in. They were just using a couple of weeks a year, and as a result the shops weren't getting used and the communities broke down and the prices of the houses went through the roof. And then the children from those villages could no longer afford to live there, and they had to move away from their families, which is something that they've never had to do in thousands of years before that. So we have had for many years nice examples out there, or you call them nice, probably the wrong word. We've had some pretty horrific examples of what happens to communities when the rich are allowed to just take houses and destroy communities like that. But nobody's learned from it. Nobody's learned the immorality of making money from homes. Just that in itself I find offensive, and yet most people are encouraged from a very early age to get on the housing ladder. That's what you need to do to be someone. That's what you need to do to make money. Well, why isn't anyone talking about the immorality of that? And we can see it now in the situation that we're left in, with kids living at home and in their 30s with no chance of getting a decent property to live in. It's all disgusting the way that it's all run and managed. It's like everything else. It's run for just the benefit of a few people.
That's right. And do you know what else has happened? I'm glad you mentioned Cornwall, because in the West Country now, I'm trying to look for the meat on the bone. Before I mention anything, I like to have black and white facts. But several people have mentioned to me that a previous politician, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, what they did is they moved really awful criminal families out of inner cities and into little Devon and Cornish villages. And the crime rate, then they could show statistically that was going down in the cities, and it was then going up in the country areas. And I know that from a fact, and I've actually heard that from 3 separate people. They've told me this, but I'm trying to find the meat on the bone, and I can't. So I can't say, yes, it says it here, because I can't. But I've just heard, and I just wonder if anybody else has heard that. You know, where little villages they used to live in that were hardly any crime, virtually none at all, are now crime-ridden because they've moved toe rags from inner cities down into these small villages. I don't know. Have you heard anything about that at all?
Yeah, this has been going on a long time. But what I do notice is that things like, for instance, when I go around the countryside, I like to go and look in old churches, and most of them are locked because they've had a lot of stuff stolen out of them. But I suppose you've got now people driving around, even into small places, just taking whatever they can. And the thing is that, as we know, they want to move people out of the country. I mean, if you can go back quite a long time, and you can remember when country pubs and country places used to be cheap, they're really expensive now, shockingly expensive. And you go through these little villages and go, God, how can these people survive? And you've got these people running these places that look like they're almost a hobby, these businesses, you know? And that's what it's turned into. It's a fake economy. And what Tony was bringing up was a very good point, the inflation in the price of property. Now, building has never been cheaper, and you can see that reflected in the crap that they build these days. You go back to those houses, the old 2 up, 2 downs, at the turn of the century, and they were really quite well built, but they were the equivalent of Wimpy and Barrett homes, all that stuff that came out in the 80s and 90s now. And when we look about these developments like you're talking about, Chris, and they're not well built. And this is the thing, that the cost of building has plummeted, but the actual price of property has gone through the roof. And the idea of kids living at home till their 30s and 40s, that's a reality now. And when I was younger, I was, even though I didn't have a good job or anything, but I managed to buy a little house. It wasn't beyond anybody's means to do that.
That's right.
And now it's like a dream. But this is the global action plan. This is communism. This is basically like I was documentary the other night about America, and these people who are really poor, they're given a token, and it means that they get a little bit of help to live in a better area, and they're fighting to get into these areas. And then you've got the locals going, we don't want them here. Well, these people are all working, they're not going to see them all day. But it's kind of the whole thing is engineered on a big scale. So I found it quite interesting talking tonight about what's happening out of London, and we have talked about it in some ways, in some depth, but you've got a very good handle on it, Chris. So I'd like you to finish the show off, because of obviously your background in architecture. What do you think's the future for small places and small towns and small villages in this country?
Well, I don't think there is a future, because if you look historically, all societies that break down, because for a community to exist, there has to be things that bond them together, and there's no bonding at all. It's just artificial. And when you look at different, for instance, the Egyptians, the Aztecs, right the way through, they all broke down because there was nothing to bond the society together. And I feel what the objective is to make the countryside almost uninhabitable and move us into large conglomerate towns, like you said, where we just can't move anywhere. And this idea where they're going to have, Yorkshire's going to get independence, probably Hertfordshire will. That all sounds very good for democracy. No, there'll be zones where if you go from one zone to the other, you're going to have to give a reason why you're going to that zone. And I'm positive that's coming. I really am. I'm positive that it's to control people. It's not for democracy at all. It's a load of old rubbish.
No, this is called controlling the narrative and bringing their own people in, and it's the opposite of what community is meant to be, which is meant to be people who know each other and all kind of work and live in one place, but they kind of interdependent in the respect that they use each other's skills and abilities, and everyone makes a few quid. But that's not what big global government's about. It's about taking that away. So all you have to do is kick the change agents out and start bartering, and stop paying your taxes to these bloody thieves as well, if you can get away with it. Because the whole thing is, it's this able hive worker taxation scheme, which is Agenda 21, is so horrendous. It just boggles the mind. But let's just finish off with this quote. This is about community organising, which we touched on. It's delineated on the Citizens UK website, another change agent group, a prominent UK organisation advocating community organising, as communities coming together to compel public authorities and businesses to respond to the needs of ordinary people. In other words, they mop everybody up into the collective narrative. That's what they're talking about. Communities coming together is mopping people up into consensus, into a hive mind collective reality, which kills any individual thought or any individual action. In other words, self-employment or anything that you might want to do to improve your life. That's not part of the big communitarian global action plan. It says it identifies and trains leaders in diverse communities, meaning absolute pathetic drones who fit in with the programming of this Agenda 2030. That's what they mean by diverse. They mean people without a brain cell, bringing them together to voice their needs. What, collectively? So they all have the same needs and they all voice them collectively. Yes, exactly. Barack Obama worked as a community organizer in Chicago in his 20s and never forgot the lessons he learned there. Global communism.
That's right.
Community organising has gained in prominence over the past few years in the light of Barack Obama's experience of working as a community organiser in Chicago, where he received training in the Saul Alinsky approach. There you go. So radical communism. You're right, Obama and David Cameron advocating radical communism through the big society. That's what David Cameron said in 2011. You're absolutely right. He advocated Saul Alinsky. Last word, Chris.
Well, when you look at the blandness, you used to go to different counties and say you were in Essex because you saw beautiful Essex houses. You went to the West Country and stuff. Now, when you look at the estates, we've got this just complete blandness throughout the country. And again, that's all part of the plan to depress people. You go along these estates. You could be in an estate in Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, doesn't matter. You could take a picture of it and say it's anywhere, because there's same method of blandness all the way through. And if you notice, the whole of society is becoming more and more bland. And really, when you see the people around where I live just walking around like zombies, unfortunately, I try and be optimistic about the future. I hope something will happen. But people just seem to be, oh, well, what can we do? There's nothing much we can do about it. And the blander you get the houses, people are generally react to the type of environment they're in. A bland environment creates a bland person, and that's exactly what they want. Bland people that are not going to question things. And that's what they're doing with architecture. And that's basically it.
It is indeed. And also we're being told by Jackie Doyle-Price that it's unfair for younger taxpayers to prop up people to keep their property. So she's advocating the first plank of communism when it could be sold to help pay for their own care needs. This woman wants stringing up off of lamppost. Oh, but that's hate, isn't it? We're not allowed to say that. But can you believe that anyone actually said that?
Well, I can now, because, when you think about it, a mortgage is a death grip. Why should you go into slavery to pay for a house several times over, where I believe you can produce a house for the price of, say, a new car or even a second-hand car? Houses do not need to be expensive, and they don't need to be bland, and they can be individualistic. But that is a whole different program. That would take me ages to explain.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely right. But it's just that she's saying it and she's basically invoking the first plank of communism, which is no private property. But I'd rather have something that is rather unique rather than a bland box. I don't want to live in a box, and I never have done, really. Even when I lived in a small flat, it was never a box. So the big boxes out on the periphery of London, the satellite boxes for the people who we don't know what they do, but they could be change agents. Yeah. And they're big four-wheel drives outside that they can't use because of the road humps, and they can't take their children to school in case they get fined. So they're going to be the new inhabitants of these places on the outskirts of London. And one day we'll find out what they do. So thanks for coming on, Chris.
Thanks.
And we probably need to follow this up because we didn't get through a lot of the stuff we were going to talk about.
Well, thank you very much. It's very good of you, and it's much appreciated for giving me a voice, because often, I guess you find this, you feel like you're a lone voice in these matters. Although I think there is a tidal wave starting to begin. People are starting to wake up. I really do believe that. But unfortunately, they're doing it very, very slowly.
Well, we'll try and accelerate that, Tony and Chris. Thanks very much. So back to Tony now, because we're going to sign off.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Mark. Yeah, especially for the humour, Chris. We appreciate that. We like a bit of humour with our dirty business that we have to deal with. And thanks to everyone for listening. It's been a big turnout tonight, especially those in the chat, as always, and their contributions, always invaluable. This week on Autonomous Media, we've got Dr. Rock's back on Thursdays at 9 o'clock. That's all I know for sure is on, because Jack's been working really hard, and I'm not sure whether he'll be back to it this week or not. But we'll let you know one way or another, should he be back this week. Hopefully he will. And we'll be back next Sunday. And I think that's it. Have a good week, everyone. Cheers, Chris. Cheers, Mark.
Cheers, Tony.
Join me, Mark Windows, with Tony Hurst for Windows on the World Live every Sunday, 9 to 11 p.m. GMT at autonomousmedia.net.